I'm Maya, 26 years old, and I just discovered that my parents have been deliberately forgetting my birthday for the past 3 years to make my golden child sister feel more special on hers. What started as suspicious coincidences turned into cold, calculated favoritism that shattered everything I believed about family loyalty. But here's the thing about being the forgotten daughter: you learn to watch, to listen, and to document everything. And when I finally decided to stop being invisible, the revenge I served was so perfectly orchestrated that it didn't just destroy their facade, it rebuilt my entire life. Before we dive into how I turned the tables on my own family, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Are you Team Justice or Team Forgiveness? Hit that like button if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, and subscribe because this story has twists that'll make you question everything about blood loyalty. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds. The realization hit me like a freight train on what should have been my 24th birthday. I'd been sitting in my apartment, wondering why my phone was silent, why my parents hadn't called or texted. For 3 years running, they'd somehow forgotten my birthday, always remembering a day or two later with rushed apologies and generic gift cards. Meanwhile, my sister Brooklyn's birthday was treated like a national holiday surprise: parties, elaborate gifts, social media posts declaring her their princess. That evening, I decided to drop by their house unannounced. Maybe they were planning a surprise, I told myself, clinging to the desperate hope that this year would be different. I had my key, so I let myself in quietly, hearing voices from the kitchen. Perfect. I heard Mom saying, "Brooklyn's party planning is going so smoothly. I'm so glad we decided to focus all our energy on making her day special instead of spreading ourselves thin." "Absolutely," Dad agreed. Maya's always been the independent one anyway. She doesn't need the attention like Brooklyn does. Our sensitive girl deserves to feel like the center of the universe on her birthday. My blood turned to ice. They weren't planning anything for me. They had actively chosen to ignore my birthday to pour more resources into Brooklyn's celebration, which was still 2 months away. I still feel a little guilty sometimes. Mom continued, but Maya's so self-sufficient. She'll understand. Brooklyn needs the emotional support more. Remember how devastated she was when she didn't get that surprise party in high school. Maya never complained about not having a party, Dad said. She's just different, more mature. She doesn't need validation like Brooklyn does. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't neglect, this was a deliberate strategy. They had convinced themselves that I was mature enough to handle being forgotten, while my 22-year-old sister needed to be coddled and celebrated. The conversation continued, and each word was another knife twist. They discussed how much money they'd saved by not celebrating my birthday, money that would go toward Brooklyn's upcoming graduation party. They laughed about how I never seemed to mind, how easy I was compared to Brooklyn's emotional needs. I crept closer to the kitchen doorway and saw them at the table, surrounded by party planning materials all for Brooklyn. Color-coordinated spreadsheets, vendor contracts, Pinterest boards printed out in full color. The level of organization was staggering. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was systematic favoritism disguised as practical parenting. "Should we call Maya tomorrow and pretend we just remembered?" Mom asked. "Give it another day," Dad suggested. "We don't want to seem too obvious. Maybe send flowers to her office on Friday and act mortified that we forgot." They had a script, a literal playbook for their deception. I backed away from the kitchen, my mind reeling. 24 years of being the good daughter, the one who never caused problems, the one who always understood, and this was my reward. I was the child they could safely ignore because I wouldn't make a scene. But what hurt most wasn't the forgotten birthday. It was the casual way they discussed my emotions, as if my feelings were somehow less valid than Brooklyn's, as if being mature meant I didn't deserve love, attention, or celebration. They had created a narrative where neglecting me was actually good parenting. I left their house that night and drove aimlessly for hours, processing what I'd overheard. Every birthday slight from the past 3 years suddenly made perfect sense. The delayed calls, the generic gifts, the way they always seemed distracted when I tried to make plans. It wasn't forgetfulness, it was calculated indifference. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I started documenting everything. I created a private folder on my computer and began collecting evidence. Screenshots of their social media posts gushing about Brooklyn while barely mentioning me. Photos of Brooklyn's elaborate birthday setups versus my forgotten days. Bank statements showing the stark difference in spending between their children. When they called 2 days later with their rehearsed apology, "Oh, honey, we're so sorry. We've been so busy with work." I played along. I accepted their guilt flowers, thanked them for the rushed dinner invitation, and smiled while they acted out their charade. But inside, I was planning. I started paying closer attention to family dynamics I'd previously ignored. How they talked about me versus Brooklyn in family group chats. How they introduced us to their friends. How they distributed emotional labor. I was expected to be the caregiver, the problem solver, the one who helped Brooklyn through her various crises, while receiving none of that support in return. The documentation revealed a pattern of parentification that had started in childhood. While Brooklyn got to be the beloved baby, I was promoted to assistant parent responsible for her emotional well-being, her homework, even her social problems. And somewhere along the way, my parents had convinced themselves that this arrangement worked so well that I didn't need nurturing anymore. I spent months building my case, not sure what I planned to do with it, but the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing thousands spent on Brooklyn's celebrations versus minimal amounts on mine. Text message threads where they coordinated their forgetfulness. Even calendar entries where they noted my birthday, with reminders to call later while Brooklyn's was marked weeks in advance with detailed planning notes. The breaking point came when I discovered they'd used money from my college fund, money my grandmother had specifically left for my education, to pay for Brooklyn's elaborate 22nd birthday vacation to Europe. The fund that was supposed to help me finish my master's degree had been quietly drained and redirected to their golden child. That's when I realized this wasn't just about forgotten birthdays anymore. This was about a fundamental disrespect for my worth as their daughter. They had literally stolen my inheritance to fund Brooklyn's lifestyle, banking on the fact that I would never find out or, if I did, would be too mature to make a fuss. But they were wrong about me being the easy daughter. They'd created someone who knew how to plan, how to wait, and how to strike with precision. And as I stared at the empty account that should have contained my educational future, I decided it was time for my parents to learn that even the quietest daughters have their breaking point. The discovery of my stolen inheritance transformed my hurt into something much more dangerous. Cold, calculated clarity. I sat in my car outside the bank, staring at the account statements that confirmed my worst fears. Grandmother's college fund for me, $23,000 earmarked specifically for my master's degree, had been systematically emptied over the past 2 years. Every withdrawal coincided perfectly with Brooklyn's major expenses. Her European birthday trip, her new car graduation gift, even her apartment deposit when she decided dorm life wasn't luxurious enough. But here is what my parents didn't know about their mature daughter. My job at a financial consulting firm had taught me exactly how money trails work. And more importantly, how to trace them. Grandmother's will had been very specific about that fund's purpose. The money wasn't just a gift, it was legally designated for my education, with my parents as trustees, not owners. I spent that entire weekend researching trust law and fiduciary responsibility. My parents hadn't just played favorites. They'd committed a breach of fiduciary duty that could result in serious legal consequences. But more than that, they'd violated the last wishes of their own mother, who had explicitly wanted to ensure my education was funded. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd stolen from me to spoil Brooklyn, assuming I was too passive to ever discover their theft. They'd banked on my maturity and understanding nature to cover their tracks. But what they'd actually done was give me the perfect weapon for my revenge. Monday morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day consulting with a family law attorney. Sarah Mitchell was a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in estate and trust disputes. When I laid out my documentation, the bank records, the will, the evidence of systematic favoritism, her expression shifted from professional interest to genuine outrage. "This is textbook breach of fiduciary duty," she said, flipping through my carefully organized evidence folder. "Your grandmother's will is ironclad. That money was held in trust for your education, period. Your parents had zero legal right to redirect it for any other purpose." "What are my options?" I asked. "Complete restitution? plus interest and legal fees. We can also pursue charges for theft of trust assets if you want to go nuclear. But Maya, she leaned forward, are you prepared for what this will do to your family relationships? Because once we file this, there's no going back. I thought about Brooklyn's Instagram posts from her European birthday vacation, 22 photos of her living her best life on my grandmother's dime. I thought about my parents' casual dismissal of my feelings, their assumption that I would just accept being the forgotten daughter forever. I thought about 3 years of deliberately ignored birthdays and a lifetime of being the responsible one, while Brooklyn got to be the treasured princess. I'm ready, I told her, but legal action was just one prong of my strategy. That afternoon, I opened a new bank account and began redirecting my direct deposit. If my parents thought I was financially dependent on their approval, they had another thing coming. I'd been living modestly, saving money, building my credit. I didn't need their financial support, but I was done pretending their emotional neglect didn't matter. Next, I started what I privately called Operation Documentation. Every family interaction would be recorded legally, of course. My state allowed one-party consent recording, which meant I could document their continued deception without breaking any laws. I bought a discreet recording device and began capturing conversations. The recordings were devastating. Family dinner became a masterclass in gaslighting, as my parents continued their performance of loving equality while actually orchestrating my continued marginalization. When I mentioned feeling forgotten, they insisted I was too sensitive. When I brought up birthday plans, they changed the subject to Brooklyn's latest achievement. They had perfected the art of making me feel crazy for noticing their obvious favoritism. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source: Brooklyn herself. During what she thought was a private conversation with Mom, I recorded her casually mentioning how nice it was that they focused on her special occasions, since I didn't really care about that stuff anyway. She wasn't malicious, she'd simply been raised to believe that she deserved more attention, more resources, more love than her sister. Maya's always been weird about birthdays, Brooklyn said on the recording. Remember how she used to make such a big deal about them when we were kids? I'm glad she got over that phase. It's so much better when it's just about me, you know. Mom's response made my blood boil. Exactly, sweetheart. Maya matured out of needing that kind of attention. You're our baby, you'll always need extra love. They hadn't just decided I didn't deserve celebration, they'd convinced themselves and Brooklyn that I had chosen to be forgotten. They'd rewritten family history to make their neglect seem like my preference. That evening, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by evidence of 24 years of systematic emotional neglect and financial theft. But instead of feeling devastated, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: power. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't trying to accommodate their narrative or manage their feelings. I was simply preparing to tell the truth. I started drafting what I mentally called the reveal, a comprehensive presentation of their deception that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Bank statements, recordings, timeline of broken promises, documentation of stolen inheritance money. Not an emotional outburst, but a cold, factual presentation of their behavior patterns. But timing would be everything. I needed the perfect moment when their hypocrisy would be impossible to ignore or explain away. Brooklyn's graduation party was coming up in 6 weeks, another elaborate celebration funded partially by my stolen inheritance money. The guest list included extended family, friends, even some of my parents' colleagues. It would be the perfect stage for my revelation. I began planning my attendance at that party with military precision. I would arrive with legal documentation, audio evidence, and a presentation that would expose their systematic favoritism in front of everyone who mattered to them. Not just my nuclear family, but their entire social circle who had been unwittingly participating in the mythology of their perfect parenting. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I would simply tell the truth. No dramatics, no emotional manipulation, just facts, evidence, and consequences. After years of being the invisible daughter, I was going to make sure they never forgot me again. With 6 weeks until Brooklyn's graduation party, I shifted into full preparation mode. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep this favoritism rabbit hole went. I started reaching out to extended family members, carefully probing their perspectives on my parents' parenting style without revealing my larger plan. The conversations were eye-opening in ways I hadn't expected. My Aunt Rachel, Mom's sister, had apparently noticed the disparity for years but assumed it was just different parenting styles for different personality types. "Your mom always said you were her little independent spirit," Rachel told me over coffee. "She bragged about how you never needed the attention Brooklyn did." "Did she ever mention my birthdays?" I asked casually. Rachel paused, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "You know, now that you mention it, she talks about Brooklyn's birthday planning for months in advance, but I don't think she's ever mentioned yours. I just figured you preferred smaller celebrations." I was discovering that my parents hadn't just gaslit me, they'd gaslit our entire extended family into believing their narrative about my supposed preference for being ignored. They'd spun a story so convincing that even loving relatives had bought into the idea that I was naturally suited for neglect. My cousin James, who was closer to my age, provided even more disturbing insight. "Dude, your parents are always posting about Brooklyn's achievements on Facebook, but I realized I haven't seen a single post about you in like 2 years. I thought maybe you asked them not to or something." "No," I said quietly. "I never asked them not to post about me." "That's weird." "Maya, I'm sorry, I should have said something." "It's not your fault," I assured him. "They're very good at making it seem normal." But Jameis' comments sparked an idea. I began systematically reviewing my parents' social media presence over the past 3 years. The pattern was stark. Brooklyn appeared in 73 posts during that time frame, celebrating everything from minor work achievements to new haircuts. I appeared in exactly 4 posts, and only when I was in the background of Brooklyn-focused content. The digital evidence was damning, but it also revealed something else. My parents cared deeply about their public image as perfect parents. Their Facebook and Instagram feeds were carefully curated to showcase their family values and parenting success. This gave me leverage I hadn't previously considered. Meanwhile, I was building unexpected allies. My conversation with James had inspired him to pay closer attention to family dynamics, and he started noticing things had previously overlooked. When my parents dismissed my work promotion during a family gathering while spending 20 minutes discussing Brooklyn's new apartment curtains, James caught my eye across the room with a look of horrified understanding. "Maya," he texted me later that night, "I owe you an apology. I've been watching tonight and this is seriously messed up. They act like you're invisible." Having witnesses was validating in a way I hadn't expected. For years, Eid questioned whether I was being overly sensitive, whether my hurt feelings were justified. But having neutral family members independently notice the disparity confirmed that I wasn't imagining things. The real breakthrough came when I confided in my grandmother's sister, Great Aunt Dorothy. At 84, she was sharp as a tack and had no patience for family politics. When I explained about the stolen inheritance fund, her reaction was immediate and fierce. "Those idiots violated your grandmother's trust," she said bluntly. "Helen would be rolling in her grave. That money was specifically for your education because she worried you'd be overlooked in favor of Brooklyn." Looks like she was right. Great Aunt Dorothy revealed something that changed everything. My grandmother had apparently expressed concerns about the family dynamic before her death. She'd noticed the favoritism pattern and had been worried about my emotional well-being. The education fund wasn't just a gift, it was her attempt to ensure I had opportunities even if my parents continued their preferential treatment of Brooklyn. "Your grandmother tried to talk to your parents about the balance between you girls," Dorothy continued. "She thought they were setting Brooklyn up for disappointment in the real world while not giving you enough emotional support. They brushed her off, said she was overthinking things." This revelation reframed everything. My grandmother hadn't just left me money, she'd recognized the dysfunction and tried to protect me from it. My parents hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They disrespected their own mother's final wishes and ignored her concerns about their parenting. Armed with this information, I scheduled another meeting with my lawyer. Sarah was impressed by the additional evidence, particularly the documentation of Great Aunt Dorothy's testimony about grandmother's intentions. "This strengthens your case significantly," Sarah said. "Your grandmother's expressed concerns about favoritism, documented in her conversation with your great aunt, provide context for why the trust was set up so specifically. It shows clear intent that your parents violated." But Sarah also suggested something I hadn't considered: mediation before litigation. Sometimes the threat of legal action is enough to force acknowledgement and restitution without actually going to court. The question is whether you want resolution or you want justice. I thought about it for days. Did I want them to quietly return the money and continue pretending we were a normal family? Or did I want them to face consequences for years of systematic emotional neglect and financial theft? The answer came during Brooklyn's pre-graduation family dinner. I attended, playing my role as the supportive big sister while internally documenting every slight. They spent the entire meal discussing Brooklyn's post-graduation plans, her job interviews, her apartment hunting. When I mentioned my own career development, a potential promotion that could lead to a significant salary increase, the conversation immediately shifted back to Brooklyn's wardrobe needs for interviews. At one point, Mom actually interrupted me mid-sentence to ask Brooklyn about her opinion on graduation party decorations. The dismissal was so blatant that even Brooklyn looked uncomfortable. "Mom," Brooklyn said hesitantly. "Maya was talking about her promotion." "Oh, I'm sure Maya's fine." Mom waved dismissively. "She's always been self-sufficient. Brooklyn needs our help navigating these big life transitions." That's when I realized that quiet resolution wouldn't change anything. They weren't accidentally playing favorites, they had fundamentally different relationships with their daughters, and they saw nothing wrong with it. Brooklyn was their treasured child who deserved unlimited support and attention. I was the utility player, valuable for my reliability, but not worthy of investment or celebration. After dinner, I made my final decision. This wouldn't be resolved quietly. Brooklyn's graduation party would become the stage for a reckoning that would force them to confront their behavior in front of everyone they'd convinced that they were exemplary parents. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing my presentation with the thoroughness of a corporate merger proposal. Financial documentation, audio evidence, timeline of events, witness statements from family members who'd noticed the disparity. I even created a simple PowerPoint presentation: professional, factual, devastating. The beauty of my plan was that I would let their own words and actions speak for themselves. No emotional appeals, no dramatic confrontations. Just evidence, presented calmly and methodically in front of their family, friends, and colleagues. They'd built their reputation on being perfect parents. I was going to show everyone exactly what kind of parents they actually were. As Brooklyn's party approached, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to manage anyone else's emotions or expectations. I wasn't hoping for their approval or dreading their disappointment. I was simply preparing to tell the truth, consequences be damned. The invisible daughter was about to become very, very visible. Brooklyn's graduation party was everything I expected: an elaborate celebration that showcased my parents' event planning skills and unlimited budget for their golden child. The backyard was transformed with professional lighting, catered food stations, and a dessert table that looked like something from a magazine. Roughly 60 people attended: family, friends, my parents' colleagues, and Brooklyn's social circle. I arrived fashionably on time, carrying what appeared to be a normal gift bag but actually contained my laptop, legal documentation, and a small speaker for audio playback. I'd dressed professionally, not party attire, but business presentation attire. This wasn't a celebration for me. This was a boardroom. For the first hour, I played my role perfectly. I mingled, congratulated Brooklyn, genuinely this wasn't her fault, and watched my parents bask in the glory of their perfect parenting performance. Dad gave a touching speech about Brooklyn's accomplishments. Mom posted live updates on social media, and everyone praised them for raising such a successful daughter. "You must be so proud of both your girls," family friend Mrs. Patterson said to Mom during cocktail hour. "Oh, absolutely," Mom replied smoothly. "Brooklyn's our little achiever, and Maya's always been so independent. Different kids, different needs, you know." There it was, the practiced deflection that made neglect sound like personalized parenting. I smiled and excused myself to set up my laptop near the main seating area. The moment came during the traditional toast portion of the evening. Dad had just finished his emotional speech about Brooklyn's bright future when I stood up and gently tapped my wine glass. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet gathering. "I'd like to add something to tonight's celebration." My parents looked pleased, probably assuming I was about to deliver some touching sisterly tribute that would add to their perfect family narrative. I want to talk about family, I continued, connecting my laptop to the party's sound system. Specifically, I want to talk about how families show love, support, and investment in their children. I clicked to my first slide, a simple comparison chart showing Brooklyn's birthday celebrations over the past 3 years versus my completely blank calendar entries. For those who might not know, my birthday is March 15th. Brooklyn's is May 22nd. I created this timeline to help everyone understand how our family celebrates these important milestones. The crowd was still smiling, probably thinking this was an unusual but harmless presentation. My parents looked confused but not yet alarmed. The second slide showed financial data, money spent on Brooklyn's celebrations versus money spent on mine. The numbers were stark, thousands versus nothing. This is interesting data. I continued conversationally. But it gets more complex when we look at the funding sources for these celebrations. Click. The next slide showed my grandmother's trust fund documentation and the withdrawal timeline that perfectly matched Brooklyn's major expenses. The backyard went completely silent. I could see my parents' faces draining of color as they realized what was happening. My grandmother left a specific educational trust fund for my master's degree program. $23,000, held by my parents as trustees, designated exclusively for my education. As you can see from these bank records, that money was systematically withdrawn to fund Brooklyn's lifestyle over the past 2 years. I played the first audio recording my parents' kitchen conversation about deliberately forgetting my birthday to focus resources on Brooklyn. Their own voices filled the party space, casual and callous in their discussion of strategic neglect. Maya doesn't need the attention like Brooklyn does. Our sensitive girl deserves to feel like the center of the universe. The silence was deafening. 60 people who'd been celebrating perfect family values were now confronting audio evidence of calculated emotional neglect and financial theft. But surely this is some kind of misunderstanding, Uncle Bob stammered. There must be an explanation. I played the second recording, Brooklyn and Mom's conversation about how nice it was that they focused on Brooklyn since I'd gotten over caring about birthdays. Maya's always been weird about birthdays. I'm glad she got over that phase. It's so much better when it's just about me. Brooklyn's face went ashen as she heard her own voice dismissing my feelings. Several guests were openly staring at my parents, who looked like they wanted the ground to swallow them whole. I want to be clear, I said, advancing to my final slide. This isn't about birthday parties or even the money. This is about a systematic pattern of emotional neglect disguised as personalized parenting. These are the legal documents filed this morning with family court, seeking full restitution of the trust fund theft plus damages. Great Aunt Dorothy stood up from her seat, her voice carrying the authority of her 84 years. Helen would be ashamed of you both, she said directly to my parents. She set up that trust because she saw exactly this favoritism, and you violated her dying wishes. The crowd began murmuring among themselves, pieces clicking into place. How many times had they heard my parents gush about Brooklyn while barely mentioning me? How many family gatherings had they witnessed where I was treated as background furniture while Brooklyn was the sparkling centerpiece? My parents' colleague, Mrs. Henderson, looked visibly uncomfortable. I don't understand, she said. You've always talked about Maya being so mature and independent. Because that's the story they tell themselves, I replied calmly. It's easier to believe your child doesn't need love and attention than to admit you're playing favorites. Dad finally found his voice, sputtering about family loyalty and airing dirty laundry in public. But I cut him off with my final piece of evidence, their social media analysis showing 73 posts featuring Brooklyn versus 4 posts mentioning me, despite us both being their daughters. This isn't dirty laundry, I said. This is documented evidence of systematic discrimination between children. And since you've spent years convincing everyone that you're exemplary parents, I thought your friends and family should see the actual data. Brooklyn was crying now, finally understanding that her princess treatment had come at the cost of my emotional well-being. Several guests were gathering their belongings, clearly uncomfortable with being part of this confrontation. Maya, honey, Mom tried desperately, you're misunderstanding. We love you both equally. No, I said firmly. You don't. And that's actually okay. Parents are human. Favoritism happens. But stealing my inheritance to fund Brooklyn's lifestyle, while lying about it for years? That's not parenting. That's theft. I packed up my laptop and headed toward the exit, leaving behind the legal documentation and my contact information for anyone who wanted to verify the evidence. The party's lovely, I told Brooklyn genuinely. Congratulations on graduating. I hope you understand this isn't about you. As I walked away, I could hear the explosion of conversation behind me, guests demanding explanations, family members expressing shock, my parents trying desperately to control damage that was far beyond control. The invisible daughter had just made herself unforgettable. The aftermath of Brooklyn's graduation party was swift and devastating for my parents. Within hours of my presentation, family group chats were buzzing with shocked relatives, comparing notes about years of subtle signs they'd ignored. My phone started ringing before I even got home, with family members apologizing for not speaking up sooner and expressing support for my legal action. Great Aunt Dorothy called first, her voice fierce with righteous anger. "Maya, I've been thinking about this for 3 hours, and I want you to know that your grandmother would be proud of you for standing up for yourself. Those two needed to be exposed for what they've done." Uncle Bob, Dad's brother, called next with information that floored me. "Maya, I need to tell you something. Your dad borrowed $5,000 from me last year for what he called Maya's educational expenses. Now I'm realizing that money probably went to Brooklyn too, doesn't it?" It did. I remembered Brooklyn's sudden spring break trip to Cabo that year, an expensive last-minute vacation that my parents claimed they'd funded from savings. The web of deception was even larger than I'd documented. I want that money back from him, and I want him to know that I know he lied to me, Uncle Bob continued. "This isn't just about you anymore, Maya. They've been running financial scams using your name." By Sunday morning, my parents' social media accounts had gone completely silent. The woman who posted daily updates about her perfect family life hadn't shared anything since the party. I later learned from James that they were frantically calling relatives trying to control the narrative, but the damage was too extensive. Brooklyn called me that afternoon, her voice thick with tears. "Maya, I swear I didn't know about the trust fund money. I thought Mom and Dad were just generous with me because they could afford it." "I believe you," I said honestly. "But Brooklyn, you did know they treated us differently. The birthday thing, the attention, the way they talked about us." "You knew," I thought. "I thought you really didn't care about that stuff," she said quietly. "They always said you were happier with low-key celebrations and that you didn't need as much emotional support." I believed them. "They told you what was convenient for them to justify playing favorites," I replied. "You were raised to believe you deserved more than me. That's not your fault, but it is the truth." She was silent for a long moment. "What happens now?" "Now you learn to be an adult without them managing every detail of your life, and I get my inheritance back." The legal proceedings moved faster than I expected. My parents' lawyer advised them to settle immediately rather than fight charges that could result in criminal prosecution for trust fund theft. Within a week, they'd agreed to full restitution plus legal fees and damages. The total came to $31,000, my original inheritance plus interest and penalties. But the financial settlement was just the beginning of their consequences. Dad's brother Bob wasn't the only relative they'd borrowed money from using my name as justification. As family members compared notes, a pattern of financial manipulation emerged that went back years. They'd been leveraging my supposed expenses to fund Brooklyn's lifestyle, essentially running a small-scale embezzlement scheme within the family. Mrs. Henderson, Mom's colleague, turned out to be in human resources at Mom's company. She quietly reported the situation to their ethics department after realizing she'd heard Mom discussing both daughters equally in diversity training sessions while knowing full well that wasn't true. Mom's professional reputation as an advocate for fairness and equality took a serious hit. The social consequences were perhaps the most devastating for them. Their friend group began reevaluating years of interactions, remembering how many times they'd heard glowing Brooklyn updates while I remained invisible. Several long-term friendships cooled significantly as people realized they'd been unknowingly participating in my marginalization. Dad called me 5 days after the party, his voice broken. "Maya, we need to talk. We never meant for things to get so." Out of balance? Out of balance. I repeated incredulously. Dad, you stole my inheritance. You deliberately forgot my birthday for years. You convinced our entire family that I preferred being ignored. That's not out of balance, that's systematic abuse. We thought you were happy, he said weakly. You never complained. Because you raised me to believe that complaining made me selfish and immature like Brooklyn. You praised me for being low maintenance while spoiling her for being high maintenance. You created a system where I had to choose between having needs and being loved. The conversation ended with him asking what it would take to repair our relationship. I told him I'd let him know when I figured that out myself. Mom's approach was different. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, eyes red from crying, carrying a grocery bag full of childhood photos and mementos. I brought you pictures from when you were little, she said desperately. Look how happy you were. We weren't bad parents, Maya. We love you. Love isn't just a feeling, Mom, I said, not inviting her inside. Love is actions, choices, priorities. You chose Brooklyn's happiness over mine repeatedly. You chose her financial security over my educational fund. You chose maintaining her self-esteem over acknowledging my worth. But we thought you understood, she pleaded. You were always so mature, so capable. I was a child who learned that the only way to get your approval was to need nothing from you, I said. I became mature because emotional maturity was the only thing you valued in me. Brooklyn got to stay your baby because her dependence made you feel needed. She left the photos on my doorstep. I donated them to charity without looking through them. I wasn't interested in nostalgia for a childhood that had been spent earning love through self-sufficiency. The most surprising call came from Brooklyn's graduate school advisor. Brooklyn had apparently been so shaken by the party revelations that Shed sought counseling and discovered she had significant anxiety about functioning independently. The advisor wanted to know if I'd be willing to help Brooklyn develop life skills that our parents had never taught her. She's brilliant academically, the advisor explained, but she's struggling with basic adulting because she's never had to manage disappointment, solve her own problems, or handle criticism. Your parents created a very fragile young woman. I agreed to help Brooklyn, but on my terms. No family mediation, no group healing sessions. Just practical life skills coaching for someone who'd been raised to believe the world should accommodate her emotions rather than teaching her to manage them. 3 weeks after the party, I received a letter from my parents' homeowners association. Apparently, multiple neighbors had complained about the disturbance at Brooklyn's graduation party, and my parents were being cited for noise violations. Even their perfect suburban facade was crumbling. The invisible daughter had become the architect of their very visible downfall. 6 months after Brooklyn's graduation party, my life looked completely different. The $31,000 from the settlement had allowed me to finish my master's degree debt-free, exactly as my grandmother had intended. But more importantly, I'd learned to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate accommodation. The most unexpected outcome was my relationship with Brooklyn. Our life skills coaching sessions had evolved into genuine sisterhood as she learned to function without constant emotional management from our parents. She was in therapy, developing anxiety coping strategies, and learning that she was capable of much more than anyone had expected. I keep discovering things I can do for myself, she told me during one of our coffee meetings. Last week I negotiated my own lease renewal. 6 months ago, I would have called Mom to handle that for me. How did it feel? I asked. Scary, but empowering? I got a better deal than Mom would have because I actually researched comparable rents instead of just accepting whatever they offered. She paused. I'm starting to understand why you always seemed so confident. You were forced to become competent. Brooklyn had also begun setting boundaries with our parents, refusing their attempts to continue managing her adult life. This had created an interesting dynamic where they were now desperately trying to rebuild relationships with both daughters simultaneously, while having no idea how to interact with us as independent adults. My extended family relationships had strengthened significantly. Great Aunt Dorothy had become my unofficial grandmother replacement, sharing stories about my actual grandmother's concerns and wishes. Uncle Bob had become a genuine mentor, helping me navigate career development with someone who actually celebrated my achievements. Your presentation at that party was brutal but necessary, he told me recently. Sometimes families need a complete reset, and you provided that. the reset had been more complete than anyone anticipated. My parents had been forced to examine their fundamental assumptions about parenting, marriage, and family dynamics. They'd started couples therapy after realizing that their different relationships with their daughters had revealed deep incompatibilities in their values and priorities. Dad had called me the previous month to share something profound. Maya, our therapist, helped me realize that we didn't just treat you differently. We actually saw you as different species entirely. You were our responsible adult from age 10, and Brooklyn was our eternal child. We never let either of you just be a kid who was growing up. It was the first time either parent had acknowledged the fundamental wrongness of their approach, rather than just defending their intentions. Mom's journey was more complex. Shed struggled with the loss of identity that came from no longer being needed as Brooklyn's constant emotional support system. But Shed also begun volunteering with a family counseling nonprofit, using her experience to help other parents recognize favoritism patterns before they caused permanent damage. I see our family dynamics everywhere now, Shed told me during our first supervised coffee meeting. Parents who praise one child for being easy while hovering over the other one. It's so common and so destructive. What would you tell those parents? It asked. That easy children aren't actually easy, they're children who learned early that their needs weren't welcome. And high-maintenance children aren't actually high-maintenance, they're children who learned that emotional drama gets attention. Her insight was hard-earned and too late for our original family structure, but it offered hope for eventual reconciliation on new terms. The professional consequences for my parents had been lasting, but not devastating. Dad had been passed over for a promotion that year, partly due to the family reputation issues. Mom had been quietly moved away from diversity and inclusion responsibilities at work, but they were both still employed and had learned valuable lessons about personal integrity. My own career had flourished in unexpected ways. The confidence it gained from successfully advocating for myself had translated into workplace assertiveness that impressed my supervisors. I'd been promoted twice and was being considered for a leadership development program that would set me up for senior management. You've changed, my boss noted during my latest performance review. 6 months ago, you were excellent at your job but invisible in meetings. Now you speak up, contribute ideas, and advocate for your team. I learned that being low maintenance isn't actually a virtue, I replied. It's just a survival strategy that outlived its usefulness. The most healing relationship had been with my cousin James, who'd become my closest family connection. Had witnessed my transformation and had been inspired to examine his own family patterns. Watching you blow up your entire family dynamic to demand basic respect was life-changing for me, he admitted. I realized I was doing the same thing in my marriage, being the accommodating partner while my wife made all the emotional demands. I started setting boundaries too. His marriage had actually strengthened as a result, proving that healthy relationship skills were transferable across different types of families. As for my parents, Wed settled into a careful but genuine rebuilding process. They'd agreed to family therapy with a counselor who specialized in adult-child relationships and parental favoritism recovery. The sessions were sometimes painful but productive. Our therapist had explained, but we can create new patterns moving forward. Maya, your parents need to learn how to see you as their daughter, rather than their success story. And your parents need to understand that love requires active investment, not just good intentions. The most powerful session had been when they'd read letters of apology that took full responsibility for their choices without any defensive explanations. Maya, Dad had written, I taught you that your worth was conditional on your independence, and am sorry. I should have celebrated your achievements and supported your dreams instead of taking your maturity for granted. Mom's letter was longer and more detailed. I made you responsible for managing everyone else's emotions, while dismissing your own feelings as unimportant. I stole your childhood by promoting you to assistant parent. I used money meant for your future to fund Brooklyn's present. I am sorry for all of it. Those letters were currently framed in my apartment, not as forgiveness, but as documentation that growth was possible. Looking back on that devastating birthday discovery, I realized it had been the best, worst thing that ever happened to me. Being forced to advocate for myself had taught me skills I used daily. Learning to document injustice had made me better at my job. Discovering my own voice had improved every relationship in my life. The invisible daughter had learned to be visible on her own terms. So here's my question for all of you watching. Have you ever had to burn down a relationship to rebuild it on healthier terms? Sometimes the people who claim to love us most are actually the ones who limit us most. Drop a comment about your own family karma stories. I love reading about how people found their voices and demanded better treatment. And if this story resonated with you, smash that like button, because standing up for yourself is always worth celebrating. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life drama and justice-served moments, and share this with anyone who needs to hear that being the easy family member doesn't mean accepting less than you deserve. Thank you for listening to my family revenge story. And remember, sometimes the best thing you can do for people who take you for granted is to stop being available for it. Life's too short to be invisible in your own family. Here is to building chosen families that celebrate all of us, not just the loudest ones.